Hello students, Professor McDermott here with your video introduction to Module 4. Well, let's talk about your discussions on the African slave trade. Actually, Group 3, I want to start with you this time. You had one of the classic narratives of the Middle Passage. That was the journey that approximately 12 million Africans took to the New World after being enslaved. This story is by Olaudah Equiano. And I thought Group 3, you encapsulated his experience very nicely in the answer that Austin, serving as chair, posted. And Austin, thank you again for stepping in at the last minute as chair. I appreciated that. Olaudah Equiano was sold into slavery as a young boy. Africans who were in prison on the slave ships underwent many different and sometimes odd sufferings during the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World. Some of the many types of sufferings the Africans underwent were whipping, also known as or referred to as flogging, sexual abuse, imprisonment, and suffering from starvation, dehydration, and lack of space. While these slaves were supposedly rewarded for being able to go to the New World, many of them attempted suicide by jumping off the ship. Can you imagine being under conditions where you would prefer not to live? Not only were they forced into leaving after these attempts, but also flogged for attempting suicide, adding insult to injury. These wearied countrymen were chained together, surrounded by people screaming and crying out in pain. Many lost their appetites because of the stench in the air, and were then whipped hourly for not eating. Many of these hardships were unbearable, but some were even raped by white Englishmen. It's difficult to even imagine these experiences. So that gives you an idea of the horrible cruelty of this Middle Passage. Group 1, on to you now. You had a description by a ship's captain, a white English ship's captain who was piloting a slave ship. And you talked about the, quote, disgusting and cruel conditions like those we just heard about. And other sufferings the Africans underwent, such as being branded. But it was very interesting to see how this ship's captain justified some of these cruelties. For example, as you pointed out correctly, he said the branding didn't really cause them any pain. This is being branded by a hot iron, okay? Didn't really cause them any pain because we put palm oil on it. And it healed up after 4 or 5 days, so it really didn't amount to much. And also, Phillips said, well, the reason that we shackled the slaves together was to keep them from committing suicide, from jumping overboard. So it was really a kindness to them that we shackled them together so that they couldn't actually move. And so what you see here... I shouldn't be laughing, but sometimes human nature is so bizarre that you almost have to laugh to keep from crying, don't you? Our capacity as human beings to justify or rationalize almost anything that we might want to do to somebody else. And that was true for slavery in general, too. Group 1's second document by Brother Luis Brandayon set forth the reason why Europeans thought they were justified in enslaving Africans. And I mentioned this in the lecture because supposedly all of these Africans who were enslaved had been captured in a just war in which they were the aggressors, so they deserved to be punished by being put into slavery. Now, it's interesting. I asked the group members to comment on this, and several people did comment that they felt the Europeans must have just suppressed or ignored their own conscience. And I think that's true. I think if they had really searched their conscience, they might have known that what they were doing was wrong. On the other hand, I really liked your comments, Jack, this time, pointing out that hindsight is 20/20. And in a way, it's not fair for us to judge the people of that time by our modern standards. Because after all, every group of people is so influenced by their culture. And if their culture tells them that something is okay, and has done so for thousands of years, it's not surprising that the vast majority of people would go along with it. And who knows? There are things I'm sure we do in our society today that in a few hundred years people will look back on and say, how could they have done that? But our culture is very powerful, and it tells us to do things sometimes even that we know are wrong. So we can certainly judge the horrible evil of the slave trade, but we should also be aware that at that point in human history, slavery was simply taken for granted throughout the world. And Jack, as you said, it would have taken, and it did take, really extraordinary individuals to break out of that mindset and to expose the true evils of slavery. Group 2, you had a document by Christian Oldendorp, a missionary to Africans in the West Indies, and the thing that Oldendorp really brought out in his document was the role that African leaders played in the slave trade, because it really wasn't Europeans normally who would kidnap the slaves. At first, it was other Africans who would capture them and sell them to Europeans for their own benefit. And in the answers that were posted by Justin Lewis, very well, I sensed the surprise that you felt, that Africans could be so cruel to other Africans. And I asked you, Group 2, the very difficult question, who was more to blame, the Africans or the Europeans? And it was very interesting that in a way you seem to think the Africans were more blameworthy because even though the whole slave enterprise was driven by European demand, Africans were actually betraying their own people. And there seems to be something especially wrong with that. But Tanya and Marlon, in your responses to question 1, I think you hit the nail on the head very nicely when you pointed out that Africans didn't see themselves as one race or one people. They were divided into separate tribes that were often very hostile to each other. And so when the Europeans came wanting to buy slaves, some Africans saw the opportunity to get an edge on their rivals, the tribes that they were at war with, so that they could trade slaves, for instance, for weapons to use against their traditional enemies. And so if the Africans had united against the Europeans at first, they could have stopped the slave trade. But many African leaders saw it as an opportunity for them to get an edge on their rivals. And so they did betray other Africans into slavery. All right, I continue to be impressed by the posts and the good discussions that you're having. I think we can go even a little deeper in terms of give and take on these discussion boards. But overall, I've been quite pleased. Only one problem we've had sometimes, and that has to do with the chairs. Now, many chairs have done a fantastic job, and you know who you are, so I'm not talking about you. But there have been times when I've appointed someone as chair who really hasn't done their job, and that's a problem. It's a problem for the groups not having leadership on the focus thread. It's a problem for the people I have to get to step in at the last minute to take the chair's place, and it's inconvenient for me too. So I'm going to institute a new policy that from now on, if the person who's appointed as chair doesn't do their job fully, they will get a 0 for all their discussion questions. And in this way, I think everyone in the group will be safeguarded. Chairs for this module are Kimberly Calhoun for Group 1, Skylar McCrary for Group 2, and Michael Smith for Group 3. Okay, so this time you're going to have no extra assignments, but you will have more lectures than usual. 3 video lectures, 5 discussion questions. The documents this time, especially the ones on the Enlightenment, are a little bit difficult. So if you need help with those, email me or call me during my office hours. That information is on my syllabus. I'm very happy to help. Don't forget, the 6th day of this module is September 24th. That is a Saturday. So please post your first post for each of the 5 questions by 11:59 p.m. on Saturday in order to have the chance at full credit. Finally, I want to say, don't panic. if you look at the gradebook and it looks like you failed your exam at first, I've mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, the D2L will automatically grade only the multiple choice section. And I have to grade the short answer, fill in the blank, and essay. So the grade you see at this point is only for the multiple choice, and I haven't graded those others yet. I will let you know when I do that and when it's safe to look at the gradebook again. All right, thanks very much. Keep up the good work, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.